Imagine you write a report, right? And in it, you're basically saying an entire country's banking system is a ticking time bomb. But everyone in power, all the big shots, they tell you you're flat out wrong. Then, a few years go by and, boom, you're proven right. Well, that's exactly what we're talking about today. We're diving into the story of the analyst who did just that, and why his new warning has the financial world paying very, very close attention.
So let's just say you don't get a stamp of approval like that from a nation's former top economic advisor by, playing it safe. This quote, it's more than just praise. It's proof of the incredible impact of one man's work. His name is Ashish Gupta. And this really gets to the heart of what happens when you've got the guts to tell a tough truth, especially when nobody wants to listen.
So who is this guy? Well, meet Ashish Gupta. He was the head of India equity research for Credit Suisse. And back in 2012, he and his team dropped a report that honestly became the stuff of legend in financial circles. It was called House of Debt. And what it did was it dared to question the entire foundation of India's big economic success story at the time.
And this slide, it just perfectly captures the huge gap between what everyone thought was happening and, well, reality. The official story, everything's great. Bad loans, you'll hear them called NPAs, they were supposedly at a totally manageable 3%. But Gupta's deep dive suggested the real number was way up in the double digits. Look, he wasn't saying the numbers were off by a point or two. No, he was saying the problem was at least 3 times bigger than anyone was admitting.
So the big question is, right, how on earth did he find something that an entire country's regulatory system had somehow missed? And the answer is pretty incredible. It wasn't some crystal ball, no secret inside sources. Nope, he just used simple public data and one ridiculously powerful tool to analyze it.
Okay, so the secret sauce was this thing called interest cover. It sounds technical, but it's super simple. Let me break it down. Think about your own finances. If your monthly paycheck isn't even big enough to cover the interest on your credit card debt, forget the principal, just the interest, you know you're in deep, deep trouble, right? That's what an interest cover of less than 1 means. And Gupta, he just took that exact same simple logic and applied it to some of India's biggest companies.
And this is what he found. 15%. Let that sink in. A staggering 15% of the major companies he looked at had an interest cover below 1. In other words, they were not making enough money from their actual business to pay the interest on their debts. This wasn't just some tiny crack in the wall, folks. This was a massive, gaping fault line running right through the foundation of the economy.
And here's the kicker, the really wild part. All of this information, it was just hiding in plain sight. You had companies literally admitting in their own annual reports that they defaulted on their loans. But then you go look at the bank's books, and those exact same loans, they were listed as being perfectly fine, totally healthy. It was this huge, unbelievable disconnect between what was actually happening and what the accountants were saying was happening.
All right, so as you can probably imagine, telling some of the most powerful corporations and banks in the country that the emperor had no clothes, yeah, that didn't exactly go over well. The House of Debt report was met with, let's just call it a wall of pushback.
And that pushback, it came from all over. You had people saying, come on, these are massive conglomerates, they'll be fine, or don't worry, the promoters have deep pockets, they can just bail themselves out. And a really common one you'd hear from bankers was this kind of denial, like, yeah, okay, the sector might have some issues, but my specific loans, they're totally fine. Basically, everyone had an excuse for why Gupta's data didn't apply to them.
But this is where Gupta's approach was so brilliant. This was his defense. He wasn't some fortune teller making wild guesses about the future. He was able to just turn to his critics and say, look, I'm not forecasting anything. I am simply showing you what your own public data from the past already says. And you know what? That made his argument almost impossible to argue with. But here's the thing about data and facts. Eventually, they catch up to you. And over the next couple of years, those little cracks that Gupta had pointed out, well, they started to look a lot more like giant canyons. And the official story, it just couldn't hold up anymore. So this timeline here really lays out what happened next. You have Gupta's first report dropping in 2012. Then he keeps the pressure on with follow-up reports. And finally, by 2015, the Reserve Bank of India, the country's central bank, just couldn't ignore it any longer. They launched this massive deep dive audit of bank loans, something called the Asset Quality Review, or AQR. And the result of that review? Whoa. It was absolutely stunning. The official bad loan number shot up from that comfortable 3% all the way to 9.3%. That's basically the double-digit crisis that Gupta had been warning about 3 years earlier. It was just complete and total vindication for him and his team. So, what happens when the one guy who was right when almost everybody else was wrong starts raising a new red flag? You bet the market listens. So what's on his mind today? What's he worried about now? Well, his focus has shifted. He's now looking at what's often called the shadow banking sector. In India, these are known as non-bank finance companies, or NBFCs. The easiest way to think about them is they're lenders that kind of act like banks, but they don't have to play by the same strict set of rules. Now, they're a huge part of the economy, but because they operate more in the, well, shadows, they're a lot trickier to keep an eye on.
So why could this new problem be even more dangerous? Well, let's compare. The first crisis, that was mainly in state-backed banks. They rely on you and me, our stable deposits. Pretty safe. But this new risk, it's in the shadow banks, and they rely on funding from the market, from investors. And that kind of money, it can vanish overnight if people get nervous. Add to that less regulation and way less transparency, and you have a recipe for a potential collapse that could happen much, much faster.
And, as if that weren't enough, there's a new wrinkle. A recent very public bailout of a private bank has made everybody jittery. So now, even the perfectly healthy banks are getting super cautious and are starting to pull back on lending. And what that does is create the very real risk of a system-wide credit crunch. That's a situation where it just gets harder and harder for anyone, businesses, you, me, to get a loan for anything. And all of this leads us to the one big critical question. Okay, think about it. The state banks already pulled back because of that first crisis. Now the shadow banks are getting squeezed and pulling back. And on top of that, the private banks are getting nervous and pulling back. So, if all the major lenders are stepping away from the table at the same time, who's left to fund the economy? That's the billion-dollar question, and it's a powerful reminder of why, when an analyst like this sounds a warning, you'd better listen.